So let's get into the first lesson in our communication module. And let's talk about what happens when we mess up communication with our loved one. So, what are some of the common pitfalls that are created by us as caregivers? Well, the first one is rushing while speaking. And we do that naturally, right? We're in kind of a rush society. We all walk fast, we talk fast. So, this is kind of a natural thing we do anyway. But with our loved ones with dementia, we definitely need to slow down. It can take them up to 90 seconds to process what we're saying and for them to catch up with that as well. So definitely want to slow down. The next thing is speaking in an elevated voice. Now, this is okay, especially if you have someone that is hard of hearing or wears hearing aids. But what's not okay is necessarily having a tone that is unfavorable with that elevated voice. So we want to be conscientious of the tone that we have if we need to speak in an elevated voice. And certainly, if our loved one is not hard of hearing at all, we want to really temper any elevated voice opportunities and keep ourselves on an even keel when speaking to our loved one. We also want to refrain from being dismissive. And comes up often when it comes to hallucinations and paranoia. Now, if we're dismissive to things like this or like these, as well as other things, it can make our loved ones feel like we're not on their side, or we don't believe them, or that we're conspiring against them. So we want to try to avoid being dismissive at all costs. Too much or too complex information can be extremely overwhelming for our loved one. So we like to say less is more and simplify our conversations and what we say to our loved ones in more digestible snacks, so to speak. And we will discuss this in verbal communications. That's actually the first thing we talk about when we dive into the next lesson. So we'll give you a great overview and understanding of less is more. Asking memory questions, quizzing, and saying, remember. We see this a lot. I'm sure you see this a lot as well, and we're all guilty of it, right? Saying remember is almost an automated response. But the truth is, our loved one isn't going to remember. So when we come in with our phones and start showing pictures and saying, do you remember cousin Johnny? Do you remember Aunt Jane? Hey, this is your granddaughter, Betsy. And we often tend to do that in a rushed way. So we've got two things going there. We've got a kind of a rushed environment, and then they don't know who the heck these people are. So, think about it this way. If someone came to you with random photos, and I say random because you wouldn't know who these people are, and kind of putting it into context here, and started flipping through an album or a phone and said, hey, do you remember so-and-so? Remember when we did this? Hey, do you, like last summer at this picnic, Uncle John was there, and you had no idea who these faces were. How distressing would that be, right? And that's exactly what your loved one feels when we do this quizzing thing, or we're saying remember, or we're flashing all these photos and trying to recollect who family members are. So we definitely want to avoid this one, and this really is a big one. Too much noise, distractions, and hearing aid problems. So yeah, too much noise and distractions. That's discomforting for anybody, even us, not just people with dementia. So being mindful of the amount of noise we have in the home, we have in the car, will definitely keep a more even temperament for not only your loved one, but for you as well, right? So definitely keep an eye on noise levels. Not stepping into their world or their reality. Now, this is something we will also get into in the next lesson for verbal communication. And we've touched on this a little bit in prior lessons, but this is where we need to get into that creative space that we talked about in preparing to be a caregiver. Sometimes you need to be an actor and just go with whatever your loved one is talking about. And it might be a different time period, for example. So if your loved one is living in the 60s, which is something that my mom often did. She was definitely in the 60s and was back in her job that she had when she was in the 60s, which was a flight attendant. And, we had many conversations around that. You got to stick with that conversation. If you try to push them out of that, wherever they are in their reality, you're going to set yourself up for a big pitfall. So, how does poor communication show up? Well, it certainly shows up with frustration. And I'm not just talking about for your loved one, but also for you. Think about it, like when you can't communicate with somebody, it becomes very frustrating, and it's actually a communication blocker, right? When two parties are frustrated, you're not going to get very far in your communication. Your loved one can also become fixated on one part of a conversation. So, for example, if you say, tomorrow we're going to go to the dentist, well, your loved one might become fixated on the tomorrow part, right? So they might start asking you, like, when are we going to the dentist? Is it time yet? Are we going tomorrow? And just become fixated on that part. So again, going back to that less is more and simplifying, it might be better just to wait till the day of the dentist appointment, and when you're ready to go, say, let's go to the dentist, right? Keep it simple and keep it right to the time period and the point that you're actually leaving. And of course, your loved one may withdraw if they become frustrated, or if they're in distress from the conversation, or there's an elevated voice, or they can't keep up because we're rushing when we talk. They're certainly probably going to shut down. And then there's anger, right? So anger is very common. That kind of goes with frustration hand in hand. Once we become frustrated, we can become angry. And that's kind of shows up in a lot of conversations, not just with our loved one, but it may come up a little bit more often when we are trying to communicate and understand what our loved one is trying to say. So, what are some simple tips for every conversation with your loved one? The first thing we want to do is slow down. And I already mentioned this. It can take up to 90 seconds. 90 seconds. So, if you just sit right now for 90 seconds and not do anything, that'll be a real eye opener of how long it can take your loved one to catch up with what you are saying and for them to have a response. I highly suggest you try that just for fun. And it's, like I said, it's pretty eye-opening when you sit down and do that. So we don't want to jump in during that 90-second period and try and fill in the gaps for them right away. We want to give them some time to work through their conversation and process their own thoughts. So an example is if they're starting to say, I need to go to, we don't want to jump in right away and say to the bathroom, to your bedroom, to watch TV. Just give them some time to finish out their sentence. And it may take a while. That's okay. But if you do see them struggling and they're getting stressed because they can't come up with the word, gently go ahead and help them out with finding the right word and finishing what they want to say. Now, this is also part of being a detective that we talk about. You're going to have to use some deductive reasoning and logic to actually narrow down or interpret what your loved one is trying to communicate with you. And there's a couple different things we need to do in order to become a great communicator, especially when we're in a situation with dementia. The first thing we want to do is speak at eye level. So we want to get down on their level. So if they're sitting, we want to kneel down and be able to look at them in the eye. This is just good practice with any kind of communication, actually, but truly one that you need to practice with your loved one. The next thing is to become a good listener. And this is not only do we want to hear what they are saying, we actually want to listen to what they are telling us. And again, being a detective, figuring out what they're trying to actually say if they are having trouble letting us know exactly what their needs are, what they're trying to tell us. And then we also want to listen with our heart, right? So we want to remain warm and loving even when we're having difficulties in our conversations. Even when we become frustrated or angry, we want to remain warm and loving. And if we need to, we just take a step back, take a time out, and come back to it with a warm and loving heart. And we want to be respectful that they are adults. We definitely don't want to treat our loved ones like a child or dismiss their maturity, right? They are adults that have lived full lives, and we want to be completely respectful of that. And like I said earlier, if all of this becomes too much and you're just frazzled with the conversation and you're not getting anywhere, take a step back, reset, take a time out and come back and try again. There's no shame in that whatsoever. And in fact, it can be quite effective way of turning communication around that's not necessarily going in the right direction. So that's it for communication pitfalls. The next lesson will be all about verbal communication. And what we just talked about is kind of an outline of what's coming next in greater detail. So this is a big lesson. So put on your seatbelt and get ready for some good stuff. And we'll see you in the next lesson.